$1,500 a week in the 1950s could not buy Charles Herbert a normal childhood, but it bought his family a royal life and himself a ticket to hell. The 8-year-old was the sole financial provider, paying the rent and supporting his parents since before he could read. The moment his voice began to change at 14, studios immediately threw him to the streets without a single word of thanks. Stripped of his fortune and youth, the teenager collapsed into a homeless drug addict for 4 agonizing decades in the barren desert. This horrifying torment only ended when an organization intervened to put him in rehab, helping Hollywood's most expensive child actor proudly survive and pass away sober in 2015. In the 1950s, America experienced widespread economic growth. Suburbs expanded rapidly across the country. Simultaneously, television entered almost every home. This powerful new industry required a constant supply of entertainment. It built a rigid system that relied heavily on child actors, like Charles Herbert, only to discard them when they were no longer profitable. The anxious, newly affluent American public developed a ravenous, insatiable appetite for easily consumable entertainment. They specifically craved sanitized family sitcoms that reinforced domestic conformity and the rapidly emerging profitable genre of science fiction. To effectively feed this consumer demand, the Hollywood studio system operated with the ruthless, unregulated efficiency of an industrial manufacturing plant. The wealthy men who controlled these studios were not benevolent paternal figures, deeply invested in the arts. They were cold, calculating industrialists operating a content factory. In this commodified hyper-capitalist environment, a child actor stepping onto the lot was categorized as a volatile piece of raw material. Their total human value was determined exclusively by their immediate ability to hit a physical tape mark on the floor, perfectly memorize a line of dialogue, and rapidly generate financial profit for the shareholders. The complex psychological development, mandated educational requirements, and fundamental emotional well-being of the child were considered entirely irrelevant to the strict daily shooting schedule. It is exactly within this mechanical, deeply predatory landscape that the tragedy of Charles Herbert officially begins. The sprawling career of Charles Herbert did not begin with a passionate, deeply personal artistic dream. He did not possess a burning desire to perform. It began with an opportunistic, almost predatory recruitment. He was not born into Hollywood royalty or a family of established performers. In the early 1950s, when Charles was just a vulnerable 4-year-old toddler, he was simply riding a standard public bus in Los Angeles with his mother. An active talent agent named Cosmo Morgan happened to be on that exact same bus, scouting for fresh, marketable faces. Morgan immediately spotted Charles. The toddler naturally possessed a strikingly symmetrical face, bright, emotive eyes, and an undeniable natural charm that cameras favored. Morgan immediately approached the working-class family, expertly sold them the glittering illusion of Hollywood success, and almost immediately, the 4-year-old child was drafted directly into the crushing Hollywood machine. What followed this accidental recruitment was a daily, unrelenting workload that would easily break the physical and mental stamina of a fully grown adult. Before he had even reached his teenage years, Charles Herbert was subjected to a crushing schedule of intense industrial labor. He physically appeared in over 50 major television programs. This included culturally defining touchstones such as The Twilight Zone, The Donna Reed Show, and My Three Sons. Simultaneously, he was cast in over 20 major feature films, acting directly alongside industry titans like Cary Grant in Houseboat, and starring as the emotional anchor in iconic horror films like The Fly and 13 Ghosts. However, this impressive resume was not a testament to a glamorous, privileged life of artistic fulfillment. It was a documented form of severe structural psychological abuse. A single standard working week for young Charles was an exhausting exercise in severe emotional whiplash. On a Monday morning, he would be forcefully instructed by a director to laugh brightly, smile widely, and perfectly play the cheeky, obedient son for a sanitized family comedy. By Tuesday afternoon, he would be abruptly transported to an entirely different, stressful soundstage and aggressively ordered to scream in visceral, unvarnished terror for a dark science fiction thriller. The physical environment of these enclosed sound stages was hostile and physically dangerous. Charles routinely worked devastating 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week. He was physically forced to stand directly under massive, primitive carbon arc lamps, known in the entertainment industry as Klieg lights. These industrial lights were required for the slow-speed film stock of the era, and they generated a suffocating amount of physical heat. They frequently pushed the ambient temperature on the enclosed, poorly ventilated sets to a blistering 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Charles had to stand directly in this dangerous heat, very often dressed in heavy, restrictive costumes, remaining perfectly still for hours, anxiously waiting for the camera to finally roll. The psychological and financial pressure placed directly upon his small, developing shoulders was astronomical. Physical film stock in the 1950s was incredibly expensive to purchase and process. If an exhausted 8-year-old boy simply forgot a single line of dialogue, stumbled slightly on a heavy cable, or missed his designated physical mark on the floor by a single inch, the entire expensive take was ruined. That tiny, predictable childhood mistake cost the studio thousands of dollars in wasted film and union crew time. As a direct result of this financial pressure, adult directors possessed zero tolerance or basic human empathy for the entirely natural, unpredictable behavior of a young child. To rapidly extract the required emotional performances, particularly the intense, believable crying and screaming scenes strictly necessary for his profitable horror films, directors engaged in a deliberate process that can only be clinically described as artificial trauma induction. Adult professionals would actively shout directly in his face, loudly threaten him with immediate termination, and aggressively prey upon his real-life intimate childhood fears, specifically to capture authentic panic on the celluloid. He was systematically, emotionally tortured by adult professionals exclusively to produce a marketable commercial product. Furthermore, his fundamental state-mandated right to a basic education was cynically dismantled by the corporate structure. California state law explicitly mandated a minimum of 3 hours of daily schooling for all working child actors. The studios, unwilling to lose valuable production time, found a ruthless, cynical legal workaround. They chopped his state-mandated education into fragmented, useless 15 to 20-minute intervals, scattered chaotically between stressful film scenes. Charles would be abruptly pulled directly from a dark, terrifying set where he was sobbing in manufactured terror, forced to sit at a small desk in a corner for exactly 15 minutes to attempt to study complex mathematics, and then dragged right back under the blistering lights to resume crying. Under these severe conditions, true functional retention of academic knowledge was biologically and psychologically impossible. The education was an elaborate, choreographed illusion designed strictly for legal compliance. This regulated, stressful environment created a profound, lifelong social isolation. Charles was effectively locked inside a profitable corporate prison without visible bars. He was permanently separated from normal children his own age, surrounded entirely by demanding, critical adults who required flawless perfection on command. He was robbed of the vital, necessary developmental stages of unstructured childhood play and basic peer socialization. Astonishingly, because he began working within this machine at such an incredibly young age, Charles was physically forced to completely memorize complex, multi-page adult scripts through endless oral repetition long before he had even been taught how to read the basic alphabet. The physical and emotional extraction on the soundstage was only the initial phase of his exploitation. The wealth he generated under those lights did not secure his future. It actively painted a financial target on his back for the adults tasked with his protection. While Charles endured this grueling, isolating physical labor, he simultaneously generated an immense, almost unfathomable personal fortune. At the peak of his childhood career in the late 1950s, the young boy consistently earned between $1,500 and $1,650 a single week. Adjusted for modern inflation rates, that specific weekly salary translates to the equivalent of roughly $13,000 to $17,000 a week in today's currency. He was officially a primary school millionaire. He possessed a level of liquid capital that dwarfed the earning power of adult professionals. Yet, through a destructive combination of familial greed and severe legal negligence by the state of California, he was systematically stripped of every single penny. The financial exploitation began directly within the walls of his own home. The sudden influx of Hollywood money shattered the natural protective structure of the Herbert family unit. A terrifying, deeply destructive psychological and economic role reversal occurred immediately. The 8-year-old child was violently thrust into the role of the sole breadwinner for his entire household. It was his daily, exhausting labor under the carbon arc lamps that paid the heavy mortgage on the family home. It was his specific ability to cry on cue for adult directors that purchased the luxury automobiles parked in the driveway. He was financially supporting healthy, capable adults who had grown entirely dependent on his physical exhaustion. This created a severe phenomenon of financial parasitism, where the child was no longer viewed as a dependent son, but strictly as a captive, lucrative income source. Grasping how a child's massive fortune could be drained so legally requires looking directly at the fatal blindness of the American legal system. In 1939, the state of California had proudly enacted the Coogan Act. This legislation was publicized and explicitly designed to protect working child actors from financial ruin. The law mandated that 15% of a minor's gross earnings must be legally placed into a blocked, court-monitored trust account. In theoretical legal terms, it was a necessary safeguard. In actual daily practice within the Los Angeles court system, the judges were grossly negligent. The state judges overseeing these child trust accounts operated with a lazy rubber stamp mentality. They routinely and easily granted constant legal petitions from parents to withdraw massive funds directly from the supposedly protected accounts. The parents merely had to utilize deceptive, subjective justifications on the legal paperwork, listing the withdrawals as necessary career development costs, luxury family holidays disguised as necessary trips to relieve the child's studio stress, expensive vehicles justified strictly for transportation to auditions, and large residential homes were all signed off by judges as necessary business expenses. The state court system failed to investigate the massive theft occurring directly under their jurisdiction. Throughout his entire childhood, Charles was legally placed in the highest income tax bracket in the United States. He paid a continuous fortune directly to the federal government. He fulfilled all his legal obligations to the state, yet the state provided him zero financial protection in return. When Charles finally turned 21 years old and gained full access to his lifelong, state-monitored trust fund, the mathematical reality was devastating. After 15 continuous years of relentless, high-pressure industrial labor and global fame, his bank account held a total balance of exactly $1,700. Every single other cent of his multi-million-dollar childhood earnings had been systematically and ruthlessly drained by the adults tasked with protecting him. The second, equally devastating tier of this financial heist was orchestrated directly by the Hollywood studios themselves. During the 1950s, powerful studios forced vulnerable actors, especially unrepresented minors, into exploitative flat-fee contracts. The studio executives paid Charles a single taxed upfront sum for his labor on a film or television episode. In exchange, the corporate lawyers secured the legal rights to own, distribute, and monetize his physical image and vocal performance in perpetuity. They legally separated the child from the ongoing value of his own labor. As broadcast television rapidly evolved and expanded globally, the specific shows and feature films Charles starred in entered lucrative syndication deals. His childhood work was broadcast on an endless loop across the globe. His face consistently generated millions of dollars in untaxed advertising revenue for the television networks for decades. Charles Herbert never received a single residual check in the mail. The Screen Actors Guild did not successfully secure mandatory residual payment rights for television reruns until the year 1960. Tragically for Charles, those newly established union rules did not apply retroactively to his previous body of work. The studios legally kept the entirety of the generational wealth he actively continued to generate. The most brutal, unforgiving mechanism of the mid-century Hollywood machine was its programmed obsolescence. The entire studio system was meticulously designed to completely discard the child asset the exact moment human biology intervened. For Charles Herbert, the corporate axe fell permanently when he reached the age of 14. He hit standard biological puberty. He experienced the natural, healthy biological changes of any developing teenage boy. He grew noticeably taller. His vocal cords thickened, causing his voice to crack and deepen, and his facial features lost their rounded, marketable softness. In the cold, calculating financial ledger of the studio executives, This natural human development was strictly classified as a catastrophic breakdown in product quality. He was no longer the cute, pristine kid that reliably sold cinema tickets to suburban families. His physical aesthetic no longer matched the specific sanitized demographic the networks required. The entertainment industry did not offer him a professional transition plan. They did not gently phase him into older, mature adult acting roles. The executives and casting directors executed a synchronized strategy of ruthless ghosting. The telephone simply stopped ringing. The casting directors, network producers, and talent agents cut off all daily communication immediately and permanently. He was entirely locked out of the studio gates without a single dollar in severance pay. He was provided without any psychological support to process the sudden loss, and he fundamentally lacked a complete functional high school education. The multi-billion-dollar machine simply detached from the host and moved on to the next disposable child. This sudden termination by the studio system triggered an immediate catastrophic chain reaction directly inside his own home. Because he was no longer generating $1,500 a week in cash, his entire dynamic within the family unit shifted violently. He transformed instantly from the highly protected golden goose into a resented financial burden. He was met with immediate coldness, deep anger, and severe resentment from the very same healthy adults who had lived luxuriously off his childhood labor for a decade. The conditional love and protection of his family evaporated the exact second the studio paychecks stopped arriving in the mail. The financial theft executed by his parents and the studios left him completely destitute at the exact moment of his discard. The highly controlled, isolated corporate environment had actively prevented him from developing basic survival skills. He was violently pushed into the civilian world without a single psychological shield. Thrust suddenly and violently into Fairfax High School, a massive public institution in Los Angeles, Charles faced a terrifying new daily reality. He possessed zero foundational social skills necessary for basic survival among his peers. He did not know how to interact with normal teenagers because his entire developmental life had been spent taking orders from adult directors. He had only ever mingled with highly stressed camera crews, demanding producers and studio executives. In the ruthless, predatory hierarchy of a massive public high school, he missed every vital social cue. He became an immediate, highly visible target for the entire student body the moment he walked through the doors. He was relentlessly bullied, physically harassed, and continuously mocked as a washed-up, expired commodity by the other students. He was devastatingly socially isolated, belonging neither to the Hollywood elite nor the normal civilian world. This immediate rejection from both the entertainment industry and his own peer group led directly to a profound identity crisis. From the vulnerable age of 4, Charles had been told exactly where to stand on a taped floor mark. He was explicitly instructed on what words to speak and exactly what emotions to physically display for the camera. He had never been permitted the necessary time or space to develop his own independent, authentic personality. Decades later, when publicly reflecting on this dark psychological abyss, Charles articulated the clinical horror of his mental state perfectly. He stated plainly, "They want to know who Charlie is, and I don't know." The absolute emptiness of not possessing a true functional self completely crushed the nervous system of the 14-year-old boy. The corporate studio system had permanently prevented the formation of his basic human ego. Unable to cope with the sudden rejection from civilized society, the financial betrayal of his family, and the terrifying void of his own identity, Charles entered a steep dive. He initiated a severe, 4-decade-long descent into physical and mental self-destruction. The immediate traumatic aftermath of his childhood fame forcefully pushed him directly into a life of severe chemical dependency. He turned heavily and exclusively to hard, illicit narcotics, specifically utilizing massive amounts of heroin and cocaine. When formally examining the post-industry lives of discarded child stars, it is clinically vital to reject the standard tabloid narrative of the era. We must not view his severe addiction as a spontaneous moral failing or a selfish pursuit of Hollywood hedonism. Under strict psychiatric terms, his massive daily drug consumption was an immediate act of biological self-defense. It was a desperate, unguided attempt at necessary clinical self-medication. Charles was actively utilizing potent, destructive chemicals to anesthetize his traumatized central nervous system. He desperately needed to physically disconnect his conscious brain from the agonizing, relentless daily reality of his existence. He had to chemically silence the undeniable fact that his entire childhood and his fortune had been legally stolen from him. The heavy narcotics were the only mechanical tool he possessed to successfully turn off the immense psychological pain. This severe, untreated addiction rapidly drove him directly into extreme, life-threatening poverty on the streets of Los Angeles. He became a vulnerable victim of chronic, long-term homelessness in the exact same city he helped build. He slept rough on the hard concrete pavement, aggressively begging pedestrians for spare change just to survive the day. He sought basic physical shelter from the elements directly beneath the concrete freeway bridges of the metropolis. There's a dark, disturbing reality to this specific, brutal period of his adult life that cannot be ignored. As he lay shivering and starving on the filthy street pavement, the television industry continued to operate seamlessly just a few miles away. The broadcasting stations were actively airing pristine, profitable global reruns of The Fly and The Twilight Zone. The network executives were actively monetizing his stolen childhood labor every single day. His recognizable 8-year-old face was beaming directly into millions of comfortable, affluent American living rooms. He was continuing to generate massive, untaxed corporate profits for wealthy television executives sitting in climate-controlled corporate boardrooms. Simultaneously, the actual living man who legally owned that specific face was treated entirely as disposable human refuse by the general public. Society heavily glorified the manufactured corporate illusion while stepping directly over the starving human asset. By the early 1990s, Charles became entirely desperate to permanently escape the crushing pressure and the psychological ghosts of Los Angeles. He forcefully fled the city limits and relocated directly to the barren, unforgiving environment of the Mojave Desert. He actively entered a prolonged period of extreme, highly isolated physical and social self-exile. He removed himself from civilized society to survive in absolute, undocumented anonymity. He lived a dangerous, transient existence inside dilapidated, uninsulated aluminum trailers in the desert dirt. He constantly battled the extreme temperature fluctuations of the harsh climate without proper physical shelter or medical care. He survived daily strictly by physically scavenging the desert floor for discarded scrap metal to sell for minimal survival cash. He functioned entirely off the standard electrical grid, completely forgotten by the entertainment industry he helped build. His only reliable source of financial income during this entire devastating desert exile was incredibly bleak. He survived exclusively on a meticulously pieced together government stipend totaling exactly $500 a single month. This survival cash was drawn from basic federal Social Security benefits and a meager delayed pension from the Screen Actors Guild. The former primary school millionaire of the 1950s was now a destitute ghost wandering the desert. The severe chemical dependency and chronic homelessness consumed the next 4 decades of his physical existence. The entertainment industry ignored the starving man while actively monetizing his childhood image. His eventual extraction from this brutal environment required an unprecedented, coordinated external intervention. But the deeply tragic documented story of Charles Herbert absolutely does not end in the freezing desert dirt. It forcefully concludes with an extraordinary, coordinated physical rescue and a complete reclamation of human dignity. This final chapter stands as a monumental testament to absolute human resilience against a predatory corporate machine. In the year 2004, when Charles was exactly 55 years old, a life-saving lifeline suddenly appeared. He was actively tracked down and physically located by a man named Paul Peterson. Peterson was a former highly successful child star himself who had intimately known the Hollywood system. Peterson had actually acted directly alongside Charles decades earlier in the 1958 major feature film Houseboat. Utilizing his own firsthand knowledge of the ruthless studio discard process, Peterson had founded a specific advocacy organization. The group was officially named A Minor Consideration, directly targeting the massive systemic failures of Hollywood. This support network was meticulously designed to actively track down, physically extract, and medically rescue exploited child actors. They specifically hunted for the discarded human assets who had fallen entirely through the intentional cracks of the entertainment industry. They refused to let the corporate studios completely bury their highly profitable mistakes. A minor consideration officially located Charles in a devastating state of total physical and financial exhaustion. He was completely broken by 4 continuous decades of severe chemical dependency and brutal environmental exposure. But the advocacy group did not offer him mere useless public sympathy or cheap Hollywood charity. They immediately provided a concrete, funded medical intervention to save his physical life. The organization completely funded his extensive, expensive medical bills without any expectation of financial repayment. They physically placed him inside a highly secure, medically supervised rehabilitation facility to begin the extraction process. They actively guided the 55-year-old man through a grueling, physically bloody, and highly dangerous physiological detoxification process. They helped his battered nervous system fight the entrenched physical grip of massive heroin and cocaine consumption. Charles engaged in a brutal daily biological battle that he had been actively losing for 40 continuous years. Against all statistical odds and medical expectations, by August of 2004, Charles Herbert successfully cut the chemicals out. He purged the illicit narcotics from his physical body and achieved a stable baseline of clinical sobriety. Remarkably, he fiercely maintained this strict sobriety for every single remaining day of his adult life. The final 11 years of his physical existence on Earth were aggressively dedicated entirely to redeeming his stolen human dignity. Operating with a clean, clear-headed central nervous system, Charles slowly re-entered the public sphere strictly on his own terms. He began actively attending classic film and dedicated horror conventions across the country, most notably Monsterpalooza. For the first time in his entire conscious life, he was not performing under severe physical duress for an abusive adult director. He was finally standing as a free, autonomous adult, meeting the actual human audiences who had watched his childhood films. He interacted directly with thousands of dedicated fans who expressed genuine gratitude for his specific cinematic work. These fans clearly articulated to him exactly how much his visceral, emotional performances meant to their own personal childhoods. This specific, unscripted human interaction was profoundly, clinically healing for his severely fractured, deeply traumatized ego. It allowed Charles to fully realize that the intense, documented suffering of his youth was not entirely in vain. He finally perceived that his physical labor possessed genuine artistic merit and brought actual joy to normal people. Paul Peterson would later publicly refer to Charles as the ultimate poster child for the exploited child actor syndrome. He correctly labeled Charles as a man who successfully survived the worst, most violent abuses of a capitalist system. He emerged on the other side of the massive corporate meat grinder with a genuine, authentic smile. On October 31st, 2015, Charles Herbert officially passed away in Las Vegas, Nevada, at the exact age of 66. The official medical cause of his death was a completely fatal myocardial infarction, commonly known as a severe heart attack. This specific fatal cardiac event was the inevitable biological invoice finally coming due for his physical body. It was the direct, undeniable consequence of exactly 40 years of heavy, unregulated intravenous drug abuse. It was heavily compounded by the brutal, punishing living conditions of chronic street homelessness and severe desert environmental exposure. His highly fragile cardiovascular system had been irreparably, permanently damaged by the massive trauma inflicted upon him since the age of 4. However, Charles did not die a helpless victim of the Hollywood machine in a cheap, publicized scandal. He died a clean, sober man, closely surrounded by the genuine respect of his peers and advocates. He had successfully permanently defeated the highly calculated, deeply lethal death trap originally set for him by the wealthy studio executives. The documented, deeply tragic life of Charles Herbert stands as a permanent, damning historical indictment of the entire American entertainment industry. It forcefully exposes the horrific, unvarnished reality of a capitalist system that viewed a developing human child merely as a depreciable asset. The corporate industry aggressively extracted his physical labor from the vulnerable age of 4. They allowed his multi-million-dollar personal fortune to be legally, systematically plundered by his own legal guardians. They intentionally crushed his emerging ego and threw him directly onto the societal scrap heap at the exact age of 14. They carelessly left his physical body to eventually pay the ultimate fatal price for their untaxed corporate wealth. Yet his final, enduring historical legacy is undeniably one of absolute survival and complete human resilience. The highly publicized tragedy of Charles Herbert fueled massive public outrage against the deeply flawed California legal system. His documented suffering became a highly effective rallying cry for advocacy organizations, exactly like a minor consideration. They utilized his specific historical timeline to aggressively push for stricter, unshakable federal and state laws. They demanded absolute protection for the personal finances, mandated education, and complete psychological well-being of the next generation of child performers. Charles Herbert was intentionally fed into a highly efficient industrial machine deliberately designed to entirely consume and destroy him. But in the absolute end, he reclaimed his own stolen name and permanently conquered his ingrained chemical demons. He eventually left this physical world as a highly dignified, deeply resilient, and completely free man. He successfully achieved a stable, completely sober final decade entirely outside the blast radius of the California studios. His undocumented victory against severe addiction stands as an undeniable testament to his extreme personal resilience. The specific, calculated mechanics of the corporate machine that destroyed him still require a final, ruthless evaluation. The quiet, strictly dignified death of Charles Herbert permanently closed his specific physical timeline on this earth. However, the unregulated corporate machinery that actively engineered his initial childhood destruction continued to operate uninterrupted. The wealthy studio executives did not view his publicized lifelong suffering as a structural moral failure of their industry. They viewed his severe chemical dependency and chronic homelessness entirely as an acceptable standard operating loss. To fully complete this forensic autopsy, we must directly analyze the exact ruthless mechanics of the corporate discard phase. The American entertainment industry relies heavily on a deeply parasitic secondary market to constantly monetize discarded human assets. The network executives often leave former child stars desperate, craving a return to the profitable public spotlight to survive, while the media aggressively constructs a highly lucrative tabloid economy entirely around the predictable psychological collapse of these individuals. Charles chose a different path. The massive studios deliberately stripped the developing adolescent of their foundational identity and financial security at the exact onset of puberty. They actively monitor the resulting psychological freefall. The media then deliberately offers the severely damaged asset a highly publicized, deeply humiliating public comeback. This specific secondary extraction phase allows the machine to heavily monetize the exact psychological damage they originally inflicted. Charles Herbert successfully derailed this lucrative secondary market by completely refusing to participate in the public comeback ritual. He absolutely refused to grant the tabloid media the profitable spectacle of his ongoing personal destruction. He deliberately starved the parasitic entertainment press of the sensationalized headlines they desperately required to sell weekly magazines. He recognized that maintaining his strict post-rehabilitation privacy was the only effective method to permanently sever the corporate trauma bond. The highly coordinated physical rescue executed by Paul Peterson and a minor consideration exposes a massive intentional failure of the state. The fact that a privately funded advocacy group was strictly required to save Charles Herbert is a profound historical indictment. It proves definitively that the massive entertainment monopolies and the California legal system possess zero institutional safety nets. The state actively collected massive taxes from his childhood labor, but completely abandoned him the exact moment his income stopped. The Hollywood establishment initially reacted to the formation of a minor consideration with aggressive, coordinated corporate denial. Powerful television network executives attempted to discredit the highly detailed, disturbing accounts of former child workers. Admitting the unvarnished truth meant legally acknowledging their own undeniable complicity in funding and actively protecting domestic abusers. The corporate lawyers utilized their financial resources to aggressively suppress the severe, documented reality of the industrial sound stages. The public evidence gathered directly from survivors like Charles Herbert was simply too overwhelming for the corporate lawyers to successfully bury. The undeniable documented history forced the legal system to finally scrutinize the intentional failures of the original Coogan Act. It directly legally proved that the state of California was systematically failing its most vulnerable, profitable working citizens. The politicians were forced by intense public outrage to drastically overhaul the deeply flawed, highly exploitative labor laws. The revised California labor legislation enacted in the year 2000 stands as a concrete legal monument to his undocumented suffering. The mandatory 15% blocked trust accounts exist entirely because his parents were legally permitted by the state to steal everything. The licensed, highly independent welfare workers currently monitoring active Hollywood sound stages are a legal response to his completely undocumented physical exhaustion. His severely traumatized childhood was ultimately highly effectively repurposed into a permanent legal shield for the next generation. We must actively recognize that the modern digital entertainment landscape presents a massive, unregulated threat to contemporary child performers. The deeply toxic financial dynamics that completely destroyed the youth of Charles Herbert are actively replicating today. They're occurring directly inside massive, profitable modern family vlogging channels and targeted social media broadcasting. Parents are once again legally permitted to completely shoulder their economic survival onto their highly vulnerable minor children. The highly regulated physical soundstage has simply been seamlessly replaced by the completely unmonitored, highly isolated environment of the private family home. The severe emotional strip mining is currently executed directly for algorithmic engagement rather than a classic theatrical film release. The American legal system once again severely, catastrophically lags behind the massive, lucrative technological advancements in global content creation. The children currently trapped inside these modern digital sweatshops possess absolutely zero federal labor protections or guaranteed financial compensation. The modern consuming public remains completely, devastatingly complicit in this ongoing, highly profitable cycle of systemic child exploitation. We actively fund the psychological destruction of these highly vulnerable youths with every targeted click and passive video view. The massive algorithmic tech companies operate entirely on the fundamental economic principle of supply and continuous public demand. The brutal content factory only runs at a breakneck speed because the audience actively demands a constant, uninterrupted stream of daily entertainment. We actively fail the next generation of child performers every single time we passively consume this highly manufactured media without question. We must actively, permanently reject the false, comforting narrative that severe psychological trauma is an acceptable cost of doing business. The undeniable historical record of Charles Herbert proves definitively that the massive corporate machine operates without a functional moral compass. It will aggressively extract every single ounce of commercial value from a developing child and casually discard the exhausted individual entirely. The flawless, sanitized entertainment consistently sold to us by the corporate media is very often a heavily pressured commercial product. We absolutely cannot separate the highly entertaining child acting on the screen from the severely exhausted, overtaxed minor off camera. We must permanently shatter the pristine corporate facade and actively demand absolute, uncompromising federal legal protection for all working minors. The enduring legacy of Charles Herbert strictly demands nothing less than the total dismantling of the industrial system that actively attempted to break him down. His highly documented, completely unvarnished story serves as the definitive manual for surviving systemic, unregulated corporate extraction. Do not attempt to negotiate with the wealthy executives or the legal systems who legally took away your developmental youth. You must permanently sever the connection to the specific source of the ongoing daily emotional distress. Charles Herbert ultimately survived his harsh circumstances because he actively recognized the entire entertainment industry was a highly damaging, completely rigged trap. He successfully executed one of the greatest acts of physical and emotional resilience in documented cinematic history. He permanently left the worn, exhausted, and severely overwhelmed child star locked completely in the past. He actively took the highly resilient, completely sober man he painstakingly forged and walked quietly, proudly into the real world. He proved that absolute, total human autonomy is the only effective defense against a highly demanding, unregulated monopoly. The massive structural failures of the California legal system actively facilitated his total financial and emotional collapse. The legislative reforms enacted decades later were built directly upon his uncompensated, undocumented suffering. We must directly contrast the massive corporate wealth preserved by the studios with the actual human casualty they discarded. Place a highly valuable, perfectly preserved reel of celluloid stored inside a heavily guarded, climate-controlled corporate vault. Directly beside this pristine physical film, place a severely emaciated man scavenging for rusted scrap metal in the freezing desert dirt. The massive corporate studio aggressively spends millions of dollars annually to meticulously protect the physical film stock. The exact same corporate entity completely abandoned the living human child recorded on that celluloid to actively starve on the street. This violently stark juxtaposition forces a completely necessary clinical examination of true value within the American entertainment monopoly. The physical film reel and the homeless man share the exact same origin point on a 1950s Los Angeles soundstage. They are both the direct documented end products of severe mid-century Hollywood exploitation. The corporate priority remains entirely exclusively focused on strictly preserving the untaxed revenue stream. The wealthy network executives completely ignore the severe human destruction required to actively generate that pristine corporate product. The American public remains devastatingly complicit in this highly profitable cycle of historical exploitation. Millions of viewers actively stream these classic science fiction films and television sitcoms on dedicated digital networks. They passively consume the highly visible trauma captured on the screen and blindly label it as brilliant, nostalgic entertainment. The modern audience passively funds the exact same corporate machine that actively funded the total destruction of the Herbert family unit. We must critically, ruthlessly analyze the severe cognitive dissonance required to actively consume this each-lie exploitative media. The viewer must deliberately choose to completely ignore the brutal physical reality of the child actor's daily life off camera. They must actively separate the terrified boy running across the screen from the homeless man shivering beneath the concrete bridge. This active, predictable mental separation allows the massive entertainment industry to continue monetizing severe human suffering. They execute this massive financial extraction entirely without facing any organized public boycott or federal legal consequence. The corporate executives operating in the 1950s relied entirely on this exact public apathy to strictly maintain their massive profit margins. They correctly calculated that the ticket-buying public absolutely did not want to see the severe physical exhaustion hidden beneath the studio makeup. The massive studios successfully supplied this artificial public demand by violently extracting the youth of vulnerable children. The severe, untreated trauma Charles Herbert carried directly into his highly vulnerable adult years was entirely deliberate. The complete lack of state-mandated psychological counseling upon his abrupt termination left him entirely unequipped to process his immediate reality. He initially relied heavily on powerful, illicit central nervous system depressants, simply to chemically silence the violent psychological flashbacks. He utilized severe daily substance abuse exactly as a highly desperate, completely unguided attempt at necessary physical self-medication. His monumental decision to permanently abandon this highly destructive coping mechanism required an almost unfathomable exertion of personal willpower. He had to consciously, daily choose to directly face the agonizing memories of his stolen childhood entirely without any chemical anesthesia. He actively chose the severe, raw discomfort of absolute sobriety over the highly familiar, deadly numbness of his addiction. He successfully executed this massive physiological and psychological detoxification entirely outside the publicized, deeply cynical Hollywood rehabilitation circuit. He completely starved the parasitic tabloid media of the sensationalized relapse headlines they desperately required to sell weekly magazines. He actively reclaimed total, absolute ownership of his physical nervous system from the lethal chemical grips of massive heroin consumption. He manually rewired his completely shattered brain to accept a stable, highly predictable daily routine of strict civilian sobriety. The specific psychological mechanics of his late-in-life redemption at public horror conventions require a strict clinical examination. When Charles attended events like Monsterpalooza, he was absolutely not seeking a highly toxic return to the Hollywood spotlight. He was actively participating in a highly controlled, deeply therapeutic exercise of reclaiming his stolen personal narrative. He stood entirely as a free, autonomous adult, meeting the actual civilian audiences who had consumed his highly extracted childhood labor. The dedicated fans he interacted with provided the exact human validation that the studio executives and his own family violently withheld. They explicitly confirmed that his grueling, highly abusive physical labor on the sound stages possessed genuine, enduring artistic merit. This specific, unscripted human interaction directly healed the massive gaping void in his severely fractured childhood ego. It allowed him to completely reframe his intense historical suffering into a highly undeniable narrative of absolute human survival. We must aggressively utilize the heavily documented historical timeline of Charles Herbert as a strict, uncompromising blueprint for future advocacy. His ultimate survival proves definitively that total uncompromising human autonomy is the only effective defense against an exploitative monopoly. He successfully broke a massive, highly lethal cycle of severe addiction and poverty, entirely with his own bare hands. His quiet, undocumented victory off-camera remains the absolute greatest triumph against the massive American entertainment machine. The stark, highly unvarnished reality of his post-Hollywood existence entirely dismantles the heavily manufactured narrative of the lucky child star. He completely rejected the highly toxic, deeply manipulative nostalgia that the massive corporate networks endlessly try to sell to the consuming public. He actively refused to let a boardroom of wealthy corporate executives permanently dictate his fundamental value as a living human being. He proved definitively that true personal wealth is measured exclusively by the absolute absence of daily exploitation. Every single minor currently standing in front of a digital camera owes a massive unpaid debt to his completely undocumented suffering. The strict welfare regulations that govern modern physical sound stages were built directly upon the severe exhaustion he hid beneath his costumes. The legal framework that protects a portion of a minor's income exists exclusively because his parents were legally permitted to steal his entire fortune. His stolen childhood became the foundational, highly necessary concrete for the only functional legal shield existing in the modern industry today. As we look toward the future, the psychological shrapnel from this completely unregulated digital era will detonate massively within the very near future. The children currently trapped inside these modern digital sweatshops will inevitably age out of their highly profitable, strictly monitored demographic. They will eventually face the exact same catastrophic identity deprivation and severe public discard that Charles Herbert endured in the 1960s. It is crucial to re-emphasize that the flawless, highly sanitized entertainment consistently sold to us by corporate media is very often a violently extracted blood diamond. We absolutely cannot separate the highly entertaining chill acting on the television screen from the severely addicted man shivering on the street. By demanding absolute, uncompromising federal legal protection for all working minors, we honor the enduring legacy of Charles Herbert, which strictly demands nothing less than the total dismantling of the industrial system that actively attempted to destroy him. He completely outlived the specific corporate executives who casually, violently threw him onto the street at the highly vulnerable age of 14. He entirely outlasted the severely negligent legal system that completely failed to protect his massive, multi-million-dollar primary school fortune. He quietly passed away from natural biological causes, completely clean and highly respected by the advocates who stood directly by his side. The medical record of his passing stands as a stark testament to a total human victory against an exploitative billion-dollar monopoly. The massive entertainment machine entirely failed to completely consume his humanity or permanently fracture his incredibly strong will to survive. He successfully reclaimed total absolute ownership of his physical body, his personal medical decisions, and his fundamental human rights. He executed the absolute greatest, most profound psychological recovery in documented cinematic history and walked away entirely whole. The corporate industry attempted to completely erase him, but his historical record stands as an impenetrable fortress of truth. We must ruthlessly evaluate the immense daily discipline required to function as an autonomous adult after such severe institutionalization. He was forced to actively suppress the deeply ingrained survival instincts completely forged under the blistering Klieg lights. The civilian world operates on objective, predictable metrics, completely devoid of the terrifying emotional volatility of an abusive film director. He had to manually rewire his central nervous system to accept a stable, predictable daily routine. Completely devoid of cameras. He completely dismantled the severe hyperarousal that previously kept him alive under the constant threat of immediate financial termination. He successfully transformed himself from a highly reactive, completely terrified corporate hostage into a deeply proactive, entirely self-sufficient man. This specific action is the clinical textbook definition of completely breaking severe, deeply ingrained trauma. It requires constant, deeply exhausting psychological hypervigilance and an absolute uncompromising dedication to personal sobriety. The American justice system provided him absolutely no legal recourse to reclaim his massive, legally stolen childhood earnings. The massive intentional loopholes in the 1939 Coogan Act legally shielded his parents and the studio accountants from any federal prosecution. The individuals who actively facilitated the massive financial theft were absolutely never formally indicted or actively investigated by state authorities. He was entirely forced to accept a catastrophic multi-million-dollar financial loss engineered directly by the state of California. Engaging in a highly publicized, decades-long legal war against the studio lawyers would have completely consumed his remaining adult life. The massive corporate entities possessed unlimited legal budgets deliberately designed to entirely bankrupt and physically exhaust any individual civilian challenger. He actively chose the immediate, severe hardship of starting from absolute zero over the perpetual, highly toxic engagement with his historical abusers. This specific, highly calculated retreat is absolutely not an act of cowardice. It is a highly advanced tactical maneuver executed by a survivor. The severe cognitive dissonance required by the public to passively consume his trauma allows this corporate extraction to continue today. He completely rejected this heavily manufactured historical narrative and reclaimed absolute ownership of his own menchas. Indeed, his deliberate, highly calculated retreat into total civilian anonymity was the ultimate tactical victory. He successfully relocated his physical body and his mental focus completely outside the blast radius of the massive entertainment industry. He recognized that the corporate studio system was a highly radioactive environment designed entirely to consume him. He chose the complete, crushing isolation of the Mojave Desert over the highly toxic, deeply parasitic environment of Los Angeles. The desert environment offered absolutely zero physical comforts, but it provided a strict, uncompromising psychological baseline of absolute silence. He was no longer subjected to the terrifying, highly subjective whims of adult film directors demanding instant emotional reactions. He was entirely free from the relentless, highly predatory media machine actively hunting for highly profitable photographs of his destruction. He manually constructed a harsh but highly predictable daily routine, centered entirely around basic physical survival in the extreme heat. He scavenged the barren desert floor for discarded metal scraps, negotiating small, untaxed cash transactions strictly to purchase daily rations. This highly primitive, undocumented economy allowed him to completely bypass the formal financial institutions that had historically facilitated his robbery. The severe physical isolation of his desert exile forced a massive, completely unguided psychological reckoning with his stolen childhood. He possessed absolutely no access to licensed therapeutic professionals or state-funded psychological counseling during this critical period. He had to manually, painfully dissect the severe trauma inflicted upon him by his parents and the wealthy studio executives. He actively confronted the agonizing memories of the blistering Klieg lights entirely without the deadly chemical anesthesia of heroin. He engaged in a brutal daily cognitive battle to separate his fundamental human worth from his highly extracted cinematic performances. He successfully realized that the corporate executives who discarded him possessed absolutely no authority to dictate his actual value. This profound psychological breakthrough, occurring in absolute dirt poverty, completely dismantles the American myth of wealth equating to success. The wealthy studio executives sitting in climate-controlled boardrooms possessed immense global influence but operated entirely without a functional moral compass. The severely emaciated man shivering in an uninsulated aluminum trailer possessed absolutely nothing but complete ownership of his own mind. The physical toll of this severe, prolonged environmental exposure and heavy chemical dependency was actively accumulating inside his body. His highly fragile cardiovascular system was quietly sustaining massive, irreparable damage during these decades of absolute poverty. The human body acts as an uncompromising biological ledger, permanently recording every single instance of severe stress and chemical abuse. When Paul Peterson and a minor consideration fundamentally altered his fatal trajectory, they physically extracted him from the desert dirt and placed him directly into a highly secure, medically supervised rehabilitation facility. They provided the exact highly funded medical safety net that the state of California and the massive studios completely withheld. The grueling physiological detoxification process required Charles to endure severe, life-threatening physical withdrawal symptoms. He actively fought the deeply entrenched, highly lethal physical grip of massive cocaine and heroin consumption. He emerged from this brutal biological battle entirely clean, achieving a highly stable absolute baseline of clinical sobriety. His deliberate re-entry into the public sphere at classic film conventions was a calculated therapeutic, tactical maneuver. He actively reclaimed total ownership of his physical image and his personal narrative directly from the massive corporate networks. He interacted directly with the civilian audiences, explicitly confirming that his grueling childhood labor possessed genuine, enduring artistic merit. He completely starved the parasitic tabloid media by absolutely refusing to grant highly sensationalized television interviews about his severe addiction. He deliberately denied the entertainment industry the morbid, profitable satisfaction of broadcasting his personal destruction. He utilized his strict, unwavering sobriety as an impenetrable fortress against the completely chaotic world of celebrity exploitation. The undeniable historical record of his life proves definitively that the massive corporate machine operates entirely without institutional empathy. The studios will aggressively extract every single ounce of physical value from a developing child and casually discard the human wreckage. The audience must finally take full, uncompromising accountability for the actual human cost of the pristine cinematic illusions they passively consume. Modern legislative updates, such as the stringent amendments to the Coogan Act, serve as a lasting legacy to the silent battles he fought. The stringent welfare protocols on modern sets exist entirely because his vulnerability was once so completely exploited. His unrecorded exhaustion became the foundational pillar protecting today's working miners. He fought his entire brutal domestic and corporate war completely in the dark, entirely devoid of any state or federal protection. The specific horrors he endured directly forced the legal system to finally recognize child actors as highly vulnerable employees. Looking at today's landscape, the unchecked realm of digital content creation poses a terrifyingly similar threat to youth. The corrosive financial structures that obliterated his early years are now playing out in real time within unsupervised family vlogging empires. Parents are once again entirely legally permitted to completely shoulder their economic survival onto their highly vulnerable minor children. The physical soundstage has simply evolved into the digital space, where emotional extraction is done for algorithmic clicks rather than cinema tickets. Meanwhile, the massive Hollywood studios currently generate continuous, highly lucrative global streaming revenue from his specific childhood performances. The network executives actively license his films to massive digital platforms for massive untaxed corporate profits. The physical digital servers hosting these specific files are heavily guarded and meticulously maintained by highly paid corporate engineers. The corporate entity spends millions of dollars annually to strictly protect the specific digital code that visually replicates his face. They will execute this massive financial investment while completely ignoring the brutal historical reality of the living child who generated that code. The absolute priority of the entertainment monopoly remains entirely focused on strictly preserving the highly profitable untaxed revenue stream. The modern audience actively funds the exact same corporate machine that actively funded the total destruction of the Herbert family unit. Millions of viewers passively consume the highly visible trauma captured on the digital screen and blindly label it as nostalgic entertainment. They actively choose to completely ignore the brutal physical reality of the child actor's daily life occurring entirely off camera. This active, highly predictable mental separation allows the massive entertainment industry to aggressively monetize severe human suffering in perpetuity. They execute this massive financial extraction entirely without facing any organized public boycott or stringent federal legal consequence. The corporate executives correctly calculated that the ticket-buying public absolutely did not want to see the severe physical exhaustion. Charles Herbert forcefully rejected this completely fabricated historical narrative constructed by the wealthy studio executives. He actively refused to let a boardroom of wealthy corporate executives permanently dictate his fundamental value as a living human being. He proved definitively that true personal wealth is measured exclusively by the absolute absence of daily corporate exploitation. His highly documented, completely unvarnished story serves as the absolute definitive manual for surviving systemic, unregulated corporate exploitation. Do not attempt to negotiate with the wealthy executives or the legal systems who legally stole your developmental youth. You must completely, permanently sever the connection to the specific source of the ongoing daily psychological trauma. Charles Herbert completely outlived the specific corporate executives who casually threw him onto the street at the highly vulnerable age of 14. He entirely outlasted the severely negligent legal system that completely failed to protect his massive primary school fortune. He quietly passed away from natural biological causes, completely clean and highly respected by the advocates who saved him. His enduring memory is not of a tragic casualty defined by tabloid sensationalism, but of a sovereign individual who took his power back. He died exactly as he lived his final years, entirely free, highly dignified, and strictly on his own autonomous terms. The massive entertainment machine entirely failed to completely consume his humanity or permanently fracture his strong will to survive. He successfully reclaimed total, absolute ownership of his physical body, his personal finances, and his fundamental human rights. He executed the greatest disappearing act in cinematic history and walked away as a completely whole, triumphant man.